They say I can put a walnut and I can crack a walnut with my butt by squeezing my cheeks.
Barry Butters does Universal Soldier. I don't really like the idea of starting a review with a trailer. It seems a bit, I don't know, obvious I guess. But the thing is, this one's pretty good, and it only lasts about a minute or so maybe we can start with it after all.
Universal Soldier.
What the hell did they do to you?
Don't know. But I'm going to find out.
One can't be controlled.
Buckle up.
The other cannot be stopped.
This mission has been canceled.
I'm giving the orders from now on.
I'm gonna teach them all.
Are we having fun yet?
The ultimate weapons of the future have declared war on each other. Jean-Claude Van Damme, Dolph Lundgren. Universal Soldier.
Stop, that is an order.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I found that pretty exciting. Funny thing is though, it seems more like a trailer that was made in the 1980s. But this film came out in 1992. Stallone had already moved on from action films at this point. He starred in the film Stop or My Mum Will Shoot in the same year of 1992. And Arnold Schwarzenegger had already gone down the comedy route 2 years earlier with Kindergarten Cop, which came out in 1990. So by 1992, this was when action films were very much on their way out, or they were certainly declining. And this goes some way to explain the poor reviews, I think, because there's a sense in which this film was very late to the party. Or you could even say that it turned up when the party was already over. So at the time of this film's release, I'd seen loads of action films, and to be honest with you, I was completely tired of them. So I was quite reluctant to watch this film at the time, but then I was pleasantly surprised. The thing is, Universal Soldier was made on a very low budget. It only cost 23 million, and it made 95 million back. So that's quite a tidy little profit. So the thing is, this was a commercially successful film, but it was a critical failure. So this film's got a Metacritic score of 35 out of 100. Most critics at the time dismissed this film as a Terminator 2 clone, and that of course was a much bigger film that came out only 1 year earlier. But as we'll see, I think this comparison is completely unfair, because this film don't really have all that much in common with Terminator 2. One very interesting feature of this film is the very large number of ideas that it crams into its story. Now I'd say that normally films that include this many ideas tend to be a bit of a mess. But the story of Universal Soldier somehow manages to pack all of these ideas into a story that is actually extremely easy to follow and straightforward. So there are three major themes in this film that feed into the story. So briefly, the first one is Vietnam, which was a very popular theme of 80s action films. The second big theme of this film is the idea of a soldier gone mad. And then the third major theme is the idea of a super soldier, and that's an idea that has its origins in comic books. So why don't we start this review with a slightly deeper analysis of the three major themes.
We will couple that strength with firm diplomacy. No apologies, no regrets.
The thing is, 1992 is pretty late for a Vietnam-themed action film, but it's also not quite the same premise that we're used to. So unlike the typical American film about Vietnam, this film actually takes things more in the direction of atonement than revenge. One very prominent theme of Vietnam action movies was the idea of American POWs who'd been left behind. There were actually speculations about this in the media at the time, and this idea made its way into the plot of Rambo 2, and it also appeared in the Missing in Action films with Chuck Norris. And in addition to that, you've also got more serious films about Vietnam. Films like Platoon and Apocalypse Now. I think there is quite a simple explanation as to why the Vietnam theme in this film received such a different treatment. Because this film ain't really a typical American production. You've got a German director and cinematographer, and then you've also got two European action stars. Jean-Claude Van Damme is Belgian, and Dolph Lundgren is from Sweden. So I think the distinctly un-American cast and crew in this film might explain why the treatment of the Vietnam theme is so different from other action movies. Films like Rambo and Missing in Action show American soldiers in a consistently positive light, so the Vietnamese soldiers tend to be very cruel and sadistic, in contrast to the American hero who's brave, pure and selfless. Just have a quick look at this scene from Missing in Action. So Universal Soldier's basically a lot more mixed. Insofar as you've got a good American soldier, but you've also got a bad American soldier.
Run!
And it shows the Vietnamese as innocent. And then the rest of the film is essentially about a good American soldier bringing this bad American soldier to justice, in a revenge story that spans 30 years. So let's move on to the next theme. And as I said earlier, this is the PTSD theme. Now, the most famous cinematic example of this theme is Apocalypse Now, where Marlon Brando played this character called Colonel Kurtz, and he was an American soldier who'd gone nuts in Vietnam.
They told me that you had gone totally insane, and that your methods were unsound.
But the inspiration for this film was Joseph Conrad's Art of Darkness, and that featured a bloke called Kurtz who'd gone mad in the African Congo. So in this film, Dolph Lundgren plays the part of an American soldier, and he's called Sergeant Andrew Scott. So there are a few moments in Universal Soldier where the mask drops and you see this emotional trauma. And it actually offers quite a bit more in this respect than you might expect from an action film.
Just like the others. You just want to leave. Like none of this shit ever happened? It happened! And it doesn't just go away. You just can't walk away, do you hear me?
Now, as I was saying earlier, the third major theme of this film is the theme of the super soldier.
It was a top-secret government project.
Pack them in ice. All of them.
Designed to create the perfect soldier.
And as I also said earlier, this idea had its origins in the comic books. Although I think we also need to mention Robert Louis Stevenson, because he wrote a story called Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And that was a story about this bloke called Dr. Jekyll who took a potion that turned him into a type of monster. And of course there were lots of film adaptations of this novel. There was a very famous one that came out in 1931. And I think this story was quite an influence over lots of later comic book stories. and particularly this idea of a serum that transforms an ordinary human being into something completely different. And I think you can see the influence of this idea in the comic book character of the Incredible Hulk. And that featured a story where this bloke called Banner is transformed into a giant monster. Although the origin of this transformation ain't actually a serum, but is exposure to gamma rays. And of course there were lots of adaptations of this comic book character too. There was a very successful television show that ran from 1978 to 1982, and more recently there's been a bunch of film adaptations too. But more specifically, there is a comic book hero that makes use of both the idea of a super soldier and the idea of a transformative serum. And this is the comic book character Captain America. And this is really the origin of the concept of the super soldier. By taking a serum, an ordinary soldier is transformed into a type of superhero, and that usually includes improved strength as well as athletic ability. But sometimes the idea of a super soldier also involves technological augmentation, and that was the idea that was behind the television show The $6 Million Man. And that was about this bloke called Steve Austin, and he had a bunch of bionic implants. In the comic books, of course, you've also got villains who make use of serum too, and probably one of the most famous examples of that is the character of Bane. Another example of a super soldier who's very famous at the moment is the character of Deadpool. And like a lot of comic book characters, he's also got enhanced strength too, as well as a generally enhanced athletic ability. So Universal Soldier borrows this idea of a super soldier from the comic books. And in Universal Soldier, the characters get their special abilities from taking this serum. As well as giving them improved strength, this also enhances their general endurance and their athletic ability, and it also gives them the ability to regenerate.
You okay?
Which is also something that we see in various comic book characters, Deadpool and Wolverine for example. But as well as all that, Universal Soldier also has this idea of reanimating dead flesh, and ultimately this idea comes from Frankenstein.
Tell me how it worked.
By hyper-accelerating the bodies, we discovered that we could turn dead flesh into living tissue.
And as if all that weren't enough already, there is one more idea too, and that's the idea of memory erasure. And this is something you often come across in science fiction. And that idea was very much around at the time because of this film called Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And the story of that film was basically all about a bloke who lost his memory. And by the way, Total Recall was based on this novel by Philip K. Dick. That was called We Can Remember It For You Wholesale. But the idea of memory erasure was also often found in comic book characters too. It wasn't originally planned as part of the character, but this became part of the Wolverine origin story in 1974. But in Universal Soldier, the memory erasure is actually done by another type of serum. Oh yeah, and there's also one other thing that I almost forgot about, and that's the fact that they're also sedated.
But to make the process work, the bodies ran at dangerously high temperatures, needed to be constantly cooled, the brains sedated, controlled. Otherwise, they would eventually stroke.
And this is the reason why they sort of come across as emotionless robots some of the time.
You're simply confused.
I'm confused.
What are you talking about, man? Let's go! Hit it!
Do not listen to her.
And I think that's the reason why this film is sometimes compared to Terminator 2.
Help! Help! I'm being kidnapped! Get this thing off of me! Let me go! because you told me to.
As well as the eyewear, of course, that gives them a sort of augmented vision.
Clear that image up. Clear it. Got it.
Yeah, so as I was saying earlier, I think this film works because it manages to fuse together all these ideas into a story that actually holds together. But I think another reason why this film works so well is because it's got jokes that actually land.
Is that supposed to be there?
Yes, yeah, it is. It's very normal.
And action set pieces that are really great.
Right, gonna rip it up, we could get a bit tonight. Gonna cause some damage, to lose. Come along.
So that brings us to the subject of tone. It contains some dark and serious themes, but it's generally light-hearted, because it's also got a lot of comic relief. And I think the reason why it works so well is because the film is serious when it needs to be, but it's also wise enough not to push the comedy too far. Now, the girl in the film actually provides a lot of comedy because she's basically like a normal person. A normal person who's thrown into this completely crazy world. So she's a character who really sells the story by making the fantastic events of the film seem more believable.
Your wound. It's healing.
So the girl is sort of a proxy for the audience. She's us, a normal person caught up in this fantastic scenario, and her surprised reactions help with that thing that we call the suspension of disbelief. But I think Jean-Claude Van Damme is very good in this film too, because he's actually very good at playing a character who has a sort of charming and naive innocence. Because he's had his memory wiped, he's very confused by everyday occurrences. You get his funny reaction, for example, when he's sitting on a waterbed.
Can't control it anymore. Got a mind of its own.
It's a very minor detail, but it's pretty funny, I think. Shortly after these events, we also get a scene in a diner, and this is one of the best scenes in the movie. Not only because the fights are very well choreographed, but before all that happens, we got another funny fish out of water moment, as Devereaux has to learn to eat again after all these years, and he does this by copying the other diners. And Jean-Claude Van Damme absolutely nails this scene. He's very good at acting sort of childlike and innocent. So tonally speaking, I think Universal Soldier manages to walk a sort of tightrope. It's got serious scenes, but they're not too serious, and it's got quite a few funny scenes that balance out this seriousness, without going too far in the direction of comedy. But I think it's time we discuss the story in a bit more detail. But before we get started, I just want to say a few words on the film studio that produced this film, because this was a company called Caracol. They produced the first 3 films of the Rambo franchise. They were also responsible for Field of Dreams, Total Recall, Terminator 2, Basic Instinct, Cliffhanger and Stargate. But despite these successes, the company was actually losing money. And then they lost a lot of money with this film called Cutthroat Island. This disaster cost them $147 million, and it also put them out of business. But I just mentioned this point because I think you've got to know that the studio that produced this film was actually a company that had had a lot of successes. So the film starts in 1969, and it's the war in Vietnam, and the US Army had just secured a village against the North Vietnamese. But the thing is, this character played by Jean-Claude Van Damme, Luke Devereaux, discovers that lots of his squad have been murdered, and a lot of the innocent villagers have been murdered too. Devereaux then goes into the village and he comes across his sergeant, and that's Sergeant Andrew Scott, who's played by Dolph Lundgren. And unfortunately, Andrew Scott has gone completely insane, and he's holding this innocent young couple hostage. and Devereaux talks to Scott in an effort to calm him down, but this don't really work. He then instructs Devereaux to shoot the girl in order to prove his loyalty. Devereaux refuses and a fight breaks out between them. Scott shoots this innocent man in the head. In the process, the girl is also killed, and Devereaux and Scott are killed too, when they shoot each other and collapse to the ground. But shortly after these events, the US Army arrive, and this bloke orders the bodies to be cryogenically frozen. But then decades later, in 1992, Devereaux and Scott are reanimated, and they form part of what's called a Universal Soldier, or UNISOL program. So the film starts with an hostage situation that's taking place on the Hoover Dam, and this opening episode in the film establishes the superior training of these soldiers, as well as their enhanced physical abilities.
Who the hell are these guys?
Checkpoint 3.
All clear.
So they're easily able to kill all the terrorists and rescue the hostages. Near the dam we also see the arrival of this female reporter, and after covering the story on the news, she gets into an argument with her boss, and she's immediately sacked. But the thing is, after the mission, Devereaux starts to remember the events in Vietnam, and at this point Devereaux becomes completely unresponsive, and he won't respond to direct orders. We then get a scene back in the mobile command centre, and because there was just a problem with Devereaux, this bloke called Woodward suggests taking him off the programme, but the UNISOL commander, Colonel Perry, refuses. Meanwhile, the girl that we saw earlier, Victoria Roberts, appears outside the facility, and she wants to get the inside scoop on the UNISOL project in order to get her job back. And when she's snooping around, she discovers one of the soldiers inside this box, and despite receiving fatal injuries, this bloke is still alive. But what Veronica don't know is that she's actually been caught on camera. Colonel Perry then orders the Universal soldiers to capture Roberts before she can escape. But when they're captured, everything turns to shit, because acting against direct orders, Scott murders the cameraman, and this causes another flashback to Vietnam for Devereaux. He then disarms Scott in the same way as he did back in Vietnam, so there's a very nice sort of parallel. So Devereaux then rescues Roberts and they flee to safety. Colonel Perry responds by ordering the Unisols to track him down, because he don't want the news of the secret program he's been running to get out. Devereaux and Roberts manage to escape to this grubby little motel that's run by this middle-aged creep and his elderly mum. You've got a nice little character moment here with the old lady sitting in front of the TV, and she's listening to a TV broadcast about sex. Meanwhile, her son works as the receptionist, and there's a funny little moment where he flicks this elastic band at a cat.
I need some gas. Ran out of gas yesterday. Refueling truck will be here in the morning. You want to run a route?
So this is a very minor character moment that sort of offers an horrible insight into his life. He's like this frustrated middle-aged man who lives with his mum, and he takes out his frustration by flicking elastic bands at cats, while his mum lounges about listening to programs about sex. So even though this scene is very short, it makes the world seem more believable. It makes it seem more three-dimensional. And I think it's this sort of attention to detail that really makes this film stand out. But shortly after that, Roberts finds out that she's now a fugitive, because she's been framed for the murder of the cameraman. At this point in the story, Devereaux also suddenly collapses, and we find out that he's running at a dangerously high temperature, and the only way he can survive is by taking an ice bath. And this is when a number of different story elements all come together at once. because Veronica Roberts has just found out that she's a murder suspect. But at the same time, Devereaux follows her out of the motel room, and then he collapses on the ground naked. And then they also reveal the mother of the motel manager having a bit of a perv out the window. Yes, all that's pretty funny, I think. But poor old Devereaux and Roberts don't really get much of a chance to relax, because the rest of the Unisols turn up and they completely destroy the motel. But Devereaux and Roberts are able to give them the slip by hiding under these bed covers.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I am so sorry. Believe me, I had nothing to do with this. Really, I had no idea.
So this is another occasion where they offer a bit of comic relief. And after that, Devereaux and Roberts hit the road again. And their next port of call is a gas station. This is when Devereaux figures out that he's been bugged, and he gets Roberts to remove the tracking device from his leg. There's also a more basic joke when Devereaux, because of his amnesia, don't recognise his own penis.
Is that supposed to be there?
Yes, yeah, it is. It's very normal.
Oh, but I've already shown that clip. Maybe I've got amnesia. You've also got meta jokes, because the film sort of pokes fun at the fact that Van Damme is always taking off his clothes. And this is very much a commentary on Jean-Claude Van Damme's action persona.
It was like really one of his trademarks. We really wanted to please his audience. We studied his movies very carefully, and we realized there's certain things in every movie. In every movie he drops his clothes.
Oh, come on man, not this again, huh?
Yeah, so I think the comedy's a bit more sophisticated than you might realise if you're not paying close attention. They then very cleverly set a trap for the Unisoldiers once they arrive at the gas station, and they're caught in a big explosion. After this disaster, Colonel Perry is ordered to terminate the mission, but once Scott realises that Devereaux is now going to get away, he goes completely nuts and takes over the program himself. But while this is all going on and the Unisols are distracted, Devereaux and Roberts sneak aboard the command centre and they're able to steal these documents. And once Roberts has a chance to look through these documents, she discovers the name of Dr. Christopher Gregor. And Gregor gives her all sorts of information about the Unisol project that was started in the 1960s to create a bunch of super soldiers. And he basically tells her all the information that I described earlier in my discussion of the super soldier theme. But unfortunately, once they leave the doctor's home, Devereaux and Roberts are arrested by the police. But when they're being taken away in this van, Scott and the only other remaining super soldier at this point, GR-76, ambush the police convoy. But this chase sequence comes to an end when the Unisol truck drives off the edge of a cliff and explodes. Devereaux and Roberts then go and visit Devereaux's family, who are still alive on their family farm in Louisiana. There's another nice little touch here, which is another indication of how good the filmmakers were at paying close attention to detail, because you see this Vietnam photo where Devereaux is together with all the soldiers from his platoon, and Sergeant Scott is in the photo too, which sort of shows you how things were before he lost his mind. So again, this adds a sort of extra dimension to the film, and it also makes the fictional world seem a lot more believable. But unfortunately, this is when the party pooper shows up, and that's Sergeant Scott, of course, who somehow survived the crash from earlier. And at this point, the final showdown begins. But the problem is, Scott has had a lot of serum at this point, and he's able to beat up Devereaux quite easily. But during the scuffle, Roberts manages to escape, and then there's another echo of the opening scene of the movie, where she appears to be killed by a grenade. But at this point, Devereaux is able to turn the tables, because when Scott weren't looking, Devereaux's able to give himself a bit of a boost with this serum, and after he injects himself, they're evenly matched again. And Devereaux finally manages to get the better of Scott. After all this, Devereaux goes to check on Roberts, and to his surprise, she's still alive. She managed to survive the explosion. And the film comes to an end when they embrace.
Dolph is a big guy, and I'm also a big guy, you know? So when a big guy touch a big guy and the other big guy get nervous, the big guy hands go crazy. But I mean, it was, so all this we choreograph, we talk together, and when we start to touch each other, we start to feel each other, it's like everything go fluid.
Now, seeing as I've been singing the praises of this film for quite a while now, I think it's time for some criticisms. But the problem is, there aren't many. But I think Dolph Lundgren does overplay the villain at certain points. I think his performance is pretty good at the start, and he's pretty good in the PTSD themes as well, where he reveals a sort of suppressed emotional trauma. But then towards the end of the film he goes a bit over the top, and you've got scenes like this.
Now I'm gonna teach you about the chain of command, Private. When I say jump, you say how high!
And this. And while I don't think this is terrible, I think he could have done with toning it down a bit. In the interview, he mentions basing his character on the performance of Jack Palance in Shane.
Wanted to give him kind of a sick sense of humor.
Sergeant Scott, could I have a word with you?
I'm all ears.
He's emotional, but he's kind of having fun doing this stuff instead of being just evil. Because then there would just be one note. It wouldn't be so much fun to play, and it wouldn't be so much fun for the audience. Images of, for instance, Jack Palance and Shane, you know.
I'm saying that Stonewall Jackson was trash himself. Him, and Lee, and all the rest of them rebs.
You're a low-down lying Yankee.
Prove it.
No authority.
You take your time, because if you're doing something evil, then people are watching you, and you can really suck them in that way.
Any questions?
I think another complaint would be that Jean-Claude Van Damme and Dolph Lundgren aren't very convincing as American soldiers. And that's obviously true. But the thing is, this film manages to turn this weakness into a strength by poking fun at it itself.
Where are you from anyway? Are you from France or Canada or... I mean, I figured you gotta be French or something because of your accent.
What accent?
And the other possible complaint that I've talked about before is the unfavourable comparisons with Terminator 2, and the fact that some critics even dismissed this film as a Terminator 2 clone. But for my money, Universal Soldier has so many other things going on that the comparison tends to fall apart. So I don't really think it's fair to call it a Terminator 2 clone, because the themes of the films only really overlap by about 10%. And as we saw in the earlier discussion of science fiction and comic books, there are a lot more influences on Universal Soldier than a single film. And while it juggles all these ideas together, it still maintains a sort of lightness of touch, with lots of elements of comedy. So am I saying that this action film is on the same level as some of the 80s classics? Films like Rambo, Die Hard, Robocop, Total Recall, Terminator, and Predator? No, it's good, but it's not that good. But it is a very solid and enjoyable movie. So if you haven't seen it, I'd highly recommend that you do.
Thank you.